Welcome to your deep dive. We're diving into the story of Samson. He's captivating and perplexing. Our sources for this dive are excerpts from the Book of Judges, and then we have like a more narrative account to kind of give it more color.
Yeah, a story that's been popular for a really long time, and for good reason.
Right. It's wild. Our mission today is to kind of unpack Samson's strengths, his flaws, and then ultimately what his sacrifice means. So we're going to be diving into the complexities of this ancient hero and seeing if his story, means anything for us even today. Samson's tale starts with a prophecy. We have this barren woman who's visited by an angel.
It's a classic thing in hero narratives, the unusual birth that kind of tells you this life is going to be really important. But when the angel gives the prophecy, it adds something. It adds like this divine purpose. It really sets him apart. Even like a Hercules or a Perseus doesn't quite have that same level of preordained destiny.
Wow, that's a great point. It's like the stakes are already super high, even from the beginning. And then there's the Nazirite vow. Can you unpack that a little? What exactly did this vow mean, and what's its significance in the Samson story?
The Nazirite vow was this special dedication to God. It involved certain restrictions, so a Nazirite couldn't cut their hair, couldn't drink wine or any strong drink, and they had to maintain ritual purity. And here's where it gets really interesting. For Samson, this vow wasn't just about being pious. It was the source of his crazy strength. The sources we have explicitly link his uncut hair to his supernatural abilities.
So it's not just rules, it's like this magical power source. And even as a kid, he's already showing signs of superhuman strength.
Exactly. The sources are a little vague about his childhood, but they suggest that his extraordinary strength was obvious even then. It wasn't something that just kind of popped up. It was just part of who he was because of this sacred vow.
It makes you wonder what those early shows of strength were like. You mentioned those other heroes with special origins. Are there any parallels in their stories with Samson's younger years?
Oh yeah, definitely. We see glimpses of crazy abilities and lots of myths about figures on their kids. Hercules strangles snakes as a baby. But with Samson, there's a much stronger divine element. His strength is directly because of this vow. This agreement with God puts him on a very specific path.
Okay, so this vow is like central to his whole story. It's the foundation for his powers and his destiny. And then we have this lion incident. Killing a lion with your bare hands. That's wild. What does this tell us about Samson, his strength and his character?
It's straight out of a myth, right? The lion thing definitely shows us how strong Samson is. He doesn't need weapons, just raw power. But it also shows he acts without thinking first.
Right. He doesn't just walk away. He turns this incredible feat of strength into a riddle at his wedding feast. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. It's clever, but it also feels like he's playing with fire.
And he gets burned. In ancient Israel, riddles were more than games. They were tests of wit, social standing, and even honor. For Samson to use the lion as a riddle and then bet on it shows some recklessness.
And when his new Philistine wife is pressured to tell the answer, Samson freaks out. He kills 30 Philistines and takes their clothes as payment for a lost bet. Things escalated really fast.
Yeah, that act starts this cycle of revenge that we see through the whole story. And we have to remember the historical context. There's this intense hatred between the Israelites and Philistines. What Samson does, even if it's extreme, makes sense in the context of that bigger conflict.
So it's like this personal vendetta on top of this historical conflict. And he keeps upping the ante. He wipes out this entire Philistine army, 1,000 men, using a donkey's jawbone. That's hard to believe.
It really shows you the two sides of Samson. We see incredible strength, almost mythical, but we also see what happens when he's impulsive, that anger he has.
And that impulsiveness, that recklessness, maybe that's setting things up for his downfall. It's like the story's telling us it'll end tragically, this fall from grace.
Which brings us to Delilah.
The Philistine woman who becomes his lover and brings about his downfall. It gets darker and more complicated now, right?
Right, people see Delilah as a simple seductress, but I think she's more nuanced than that. She's caught between loyalties, manipulated by Philistine rulers who use her connection to Samson.
They offer her a ton of money to find out the secret of Samson's strength, and she doesn't give up. It seems like the story's trying to create this sense of intrigue, this game between Delilah and Samson.
It's fascinating. We have Delilah driven by the promise of wealth and maybe a desire for power over this unstoppable force. And then you have Samson suspicious but attracted to her. He tests her loyalty but tells her more than he should.
He's messing with her, giving fake answers, but you know something bad is going to happen. It's like a train wreck in slow motion.
Exactly. That's what makes it so good. The storytellers create this suspense, impending doom, while they show us this psychology of betrayal and temptation.
And finally, Samson breaks. He tells her the truth. His strength is tied to his uncut hair because of the Nazirite vow. It's like he needs to tell someone but picks the worst possible person.
It's so sad. The betrayal happens so fast. Delilah cuts his hair while he's sleeping. The Philistines get him, blind him, and capture him. It's powerful imagery. It's not just losing his eyesight. It's losing strength, losing his identity. His world is literally and figuratively dark.
They parade him around at a festival for their god Dagon. It's brutal for someone who is so powerful.
They wanted to humiliate him, crush his spirit. He went from a conqueror to a captive. Samson represents the Philistines' victory over Israel, over God. But this isn't the end of the story.
There's more to come. Even at his lowest point, Samson isn't done yet. We'll have to unpack that last act in the next part of our deep dive. We left Samson betrayed, blind, a captive of the Philistines. It's so different from the mighty warrior we saw earlier, such a tragic fall from grace. But like you said, his story isn't over yet, so what happens next?
Well, what happens next is one of the most talked about parts of the whole Samson story. The Philistines are celebrating their victory and decide to parade Samson around during a festival for their god Dagon. It's meant to humiliate him and crush any fight left in him.
Yeah, I can just picture it. The tension is building. Samson, who was invincible, is now blind and a captive, and he's paraded in front of his enemies. It's almost Shakespearean how far he's fallen.
Absolutely. And in this scene, we see Samson change. The sources say that while he's being mocked, Samson prays to God. He asks for his strength back.
It's like he's reaching back to that Nazirite vow, the source of his power, the one he threw away. He wants a second chance, but the stakes are so much higher.
Exactly. And this is where people disagree on what it means. Some experts think Samson's last act is revenge. He's angry and wants to kill as many Philistines as possible. He even says, "Let me die with the Philistines."
Yeah, I can see that. After the betrayal, the humiliation, losing his strength and sight, it makes sense that he'd want revenge.
It does. But there's also this spiritual side. Samson was dedicated to God from birth. His whole life was supposed to be about saving Israel from the Philistines. Even though it's destructive, his last act could be seen as fulfilling that destiny.
So it's not just about personal revenge, it's about God's will, about Samson being used to punish the Philistines.
Exactly. And Samson prays to God before he destroys the temple. That suggests that maybe he's not just acting out of anger, but is carrying out God's will.
It makes you think, right? We're so used to heroes who always do the right thing. But Samson doesn't fit that mold. He's strong, but gives in to temptation. He's religious, but defiant. He's capable of great love and terrible violence.
And that complexity is why we're still interested in him. He's not some one-dimensional hero. He shows us what it means to be human. With all the flaws and contradictions, he's a reminder that even religious people mess up, even strong people can be broken. But that doesn't mean they can't redeem themselves.
It's a nuanced perspective that makes us think beyond simple labels like hero and villain. What do you think motivated Samson in that final moment?
That's the question that's bothered people for a long time. Was he seeking revenge, redemption, or both? The text doesn't give us a clear answer. It leaves room for us to come up with our own interpretations. It makes us think about human nature, God's role, and what it means to sacrifice.
So we can see his final act as revenge, as God's judgment, or as him trying to redeem himself. But how have people interpreted Samson's story over time? Have there always been debates about his motivations and what his story means?
People have been telling, analyzing, and arguing about Samson's story for centuries. Every generation finds something new in it. Artists, writers, religious scholars, they've all tried to understand his character and his actions.
It's like his story reflects what each era is worried about and hopes for. What are some of the major interpretations that have emerged throughout history?
One common theme is Samson as a tragic hero. He has amazing gifts, but they're ruined by his own weaknesses. This interpretation focuses on what happens when you give in to temptation, the dangers of passion and pride. We see this in John Milton's Samson Agonites. Samson is a tortured soul who is dealing with his past mistakes and trying to find some spiritual redemption.
It's a powerful image, Samson as this tragic figure, burdened by the choices he made and their consequences.
But there's also a more positive interpretation. Some see Samson as a symbol of resistance, a champion of the oppressed who even in defeat fights against tyranny. This view celebrates his defiance, his willingness to fight for his people even when things seem hopeless.
So depending on how you see it, Samson is either a warning about temptation or a powerful example of fighting for freedom against all odds. It's amazing how one story can have such different meanings.
That's exactly why Samson's story still affects us. It makes us think. He's not a simple hero or villain. He represents the full range of human experience, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies.
He reminds us that I think a hero isn't about being perfect. It's about facing our weaknesses and finding the strength to keep going even when we fail.
And maybe that's the most important lesson from Samson's story. Strength isn't just about physical power. It's about being resilient, being able to get back up after making mistakes.
It's a powerful message, especially today when we're always shown perfect heroes and flawless victories. Samson shows us that true strength comes from accepting our imperfections, admitting our vulnerabilities, and having the courage to keep fighting even when we're knocked down.
And even in our darkest moments, there's always a chance for redemption, to find meaning and purpose even when faced with tragedy.
So, as we move towards the end of our deep dive, the big question is Samson a hero? It really is the big question, right? After going this deep into his story, his strengths and his flaws, and then that intense final act, is Samson a hero?
Yeah, people have been debating that for centuries, and there isn't one right answer. He's not like those typical heroes, the perfect ones who always defeat evil. Samson, he's impulsive, he's vengeful, he's driven by desires that kind of lead him down the wrong path. He makes mistakes, big ones sometimes.
He does. He breaks the rules, even sacred vows. He trusts the wrong people. Like, he keeps falling for Delilah's tricks, even though there are signs something's not right. It's almost like he wants to destroy himself, like there's something he can't control.
And yet there's something about Samson that keeps us interested. We want him to succeed even though we know his flaws. I think maybe it's his strength, that almost superhuman ability to get past crazy obstacles.
Or maybe it's that feeling that he's meant for something big, that he's fighting a huge force, even if he doesn't always do the right thing to get there. He's flawed, but he's also fighting for something bigger than himself.
Yeah, I think we relate to that. We like stories about heroes who aren't perfect, characters who struggle and mess up and then have to deal with the consequences. It reminds us that being a hero isn't about never failing. It's about facing our weaknesses and finding the strength to keep going.
Yeah, it's about redemption, right? Even after those huge mistakes, Samson manages to fulfill his destiny. He saves his people, even if it means dying.
And that last part, destroying the temple, it can be interpreted in so many ways. Is it revenge? Is it him trying to redeem himself? Or is it God punishing the Philistines through Samson? We don't know for sure, and that's what makes it so interesting.
It's fascinating how his story has been told in different ways over time. In art, literature, music, it seems like every generation finds something new in Samson's story.
That's true. One of the best examples is John Milton's Samson Agonistes. He portrays Samson as this tragic figure, blinded and a prisoner struggling with sadness and guilt over his past. But in the end, he finds a kind of spiritual victory, even in his final destructive act.
So even when things are at their worst, there's still hope. There's a chance for him to redeem himself. It's a powerful message that seems to resonate across time and cultures.
It does. I think it speaks to our own hope for second chances, that we can still find meaning and purpose even if we've messed up, even when we feel broken.
Samson's story tells us that being a hero isn't about being perfect all the time. It's about constantly working on ourselves and trying to be better than our weaknesses. It's about fighting for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
And sometimes it means making a huge sacrifice, doing something that matters even if it means giving up everything.
So to wrap up our deep dive into the story of Samson, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from all this?
I hope they see that Samson's story, even though it's old, is still really relevant today. It makes us think about what strength really is, what it means to be a hero, and whether we can be redeemed even after our biggest failures.
It's a story that makes us think about human nature, about what's right and wrong, and the power of the choices we make, even when those choices have consequences we didn't expect.
Samson's legacy is complex, full of contradictions. But ultimately, it's a story of hope. It reminds us that even when we struggle, we're capable of great strength and great weakness.
And that the choices we make, even the bad ones, can change things, not just for us, but for everyone around us.
His story encourages us to look deeper, to question our ideas about good guys and bad guys, and to find our own meaning in the complicated journey of being human.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Samson's story. We hope it gave you new insights, sparked your curiosity, and maybe even challenged how you see this classic tale.
Maybe it'll even inspire you to go back and read Samson's story again yourself, to really dig into it and find your own interpretation of this timeless hero.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.